My name is Sienna Cross. I was 33 when the word landed on me like a slammed door. We were at his mother's dinner table, the good china out, candles half melted from an hour of small talk I'd tried too hard to keep alive. I'd mentioned, quietly, that a piece I'd sold, a private commission, nothing anyone at that table would understand, had finally cleared escrow that morning. I hadn't meant it as a boast. I'd meant it the way you hand someone a small stone you found on a walk, just to share it. Marcus set his fork down too carefully. "Can we not," he said, "make this about your little art thing? You're embarrassing yourself." The room didn't go silent so much as it went careful, the way rooms do, when everyone already knows something you don't. I smiled, the smile I'd practiced for years, the one that costs nothing and reveals nothing, and asked to be excused to check on dessert. In the kitchen, I stood with my hands flat on the cold counter and breathed until the heat behind my eyes receded. I had learned a long time ago that the worst thing you can do to a moment like that is let it see your face. I thought about my father, who used to say that people reveal exactly how much they've measured you by the size of the box they hand you. Marcus had handed me a very small box. Embarrassing. Little art thing. 4 years of nights at the studio, the calluses on my hands, the client list I never mentioned because he'd never asked, folded into 2 words and set down between the water glasses like nothing. I didn't say anything else that night. That was the beginning of the part of me that started listening more than speaking, watching more than reacting. Not out of weakness. Out of arithmetic. I needed to understand what I was actually standing inside before I decided what to do about it. Later, driving home, Marcus scrolled his phone in the passenger seat and didn't look up once. I watched the road and thought about the commission, a sculpture I'd built for a foundation none of them had ever heard of, for a client whose name would mean nothing to Marcus's mother and everything to the small, serious world I'd built alone, in rooms he'd never once visited. I didn't correct him. I let him believe what was easiest for him to believe. It cost me nothing that night. It would cost him more, later, than either of us understood yet. The studio was the one place I'd never let him inside, not because I was hiding anything shameful, but because some rooms need to stay uncontaminated by other people's opinions of you. It was 40 minutes from the house, above an old bakery that had closed in the 90s, and the woman who owned the building had let me have it cheap because she liked watching things get built more than she liked collecting rent on time. I'd started there the way most people start things they're ashamed to admit they need, quietly on weekends, telling myself it was a hobby. Marcus called it that too in the early years, with a kind of affection that curdled slowly into something closer to dismissal. A hobby is allowed to stay small. A hobby doesn't threaten the story a man tells himself about who's supposed to be the ambitious one in a marriage. I remember the first year we were together, how he used to sit on the paint-splattered stool in the corner of my old apartment and watch me work, genuinely curious, asking questions that weren't performances. Somewhere between then and the dinner table, curiosity had turned into a low, persistent irritation, as if my working at all were a mild inconvenience to the life he'd imagined for us. I never told him about the gallery in Zurich or the private collector in Sao Paulo who'd bought 3 pieces sight unseen off a single photograph, or the foundation, the one connected to the piece I'd mentioned at dinner, that had commissioned a permanent installation for a children's hospital wing. I told him almost nothing, and at some point I stopped noticing that I'd stopped, the way you stop noticing a door you've quietly kept closed for years. His mother, Eleanor, was different. She'd never said a cruel word to me, but she watched everything with the flat attention of a woman who'd spent 40 years reading rooms for a living. She'd run a shipping logistics company before retiring, and she still had that particular gift for spotting the thing everyone else was too polite to mention. That night, after the dinner, she'd caught my eye once across the table, just before Marcus said what he said. I hadn't understood the look then. I understood it a little better by the time I was standing alone in my studio a week later, staring at the confirmation email from my accountant. The final transfer, complete, $8.8 million, the largest single gift I had ever made in my life, sent quietly to the hospital foundation in my name and no one else's. I hadn't done it for anyone to see. That was the strange, private truth of it. I'd done it because 4 years earlier, in a hospital room that still visited me in my sleep, a nurse had held my hand while I lost something I never spoke about at that dinner table or any other. The gift wasn't revenge. It wasn't even really generosity, not in the simple sense. It was the only language I had left for a grief that had never been given a name. Eleanor found out by accident, the way most truths arrive, sideways, uninvited, at the wrong moment for everyone except the truth itself. She was on the hospital foundation's board, had been for 11 years, mostly as a quiet donor and an occasional voice in meetings she found tedious. I hadn't known that. Marcus had mentioned it once, years ago, in the vague way people mention family trivia that doesn't seem worth remembering. His mother did some charity thing, some hospital thing, sat on a board somewhere. I'd filed it away and forgotten it completely, the way you forget the names of streets you never planned to drive down. The foundation held its quarterly meeting on a Tuesday. I wasn't there. I was in my studio, hands deep in wet clay, radio playing low, the particular kind of peace I only found with dust on my forearms and no one watching. Eleanor was in a conference room 40 minutes away, reviewing a slide deck about major gifts received that quarter, when a name appeared on the screen that made her set down her coffee without drinking it. Sienna Cross. $8.8 million. Children's Wing, Sensory Recovery Center. She told me, weeks later, that she sat very still for almost a full minute, running the name through every possible explanation before landing on the only one that made sense. There was only one Sienna Cross who could plausibly be sitting in that room's collective memory, her son's wife, the woman who made little art things, who'd been quietly, politely diminished at her own dinner table 2 weeks earlier while Eleanor had said nothing, because saying something in that house had never once changed anything.
She didn't call me.
She didn't call Marcus either, not right away. She asked the foundation's director, carefully, casually, whether Sienna Cross the donor was connected to any public information, press mentions, past commissions, anything. What came back was a folder Eleanor read alone in her car in the parking garage, engine off, for 45 minutes. The Zurich Gallery. The Sao Paulo Collector. 2 smaller hospital installations in cities I'd never mentioned at home. A decade of work, hidden in plain sight, under a name she'd heard at her own table 100 times and never once thought to ask about. She told me later that the hardest part wasn't the money. It was realizing how completely her son had failed to see the person sitting across from him, and how long she herself had watched it happen without saying a word. She came to the studio uninvited, on a Thursday, which was unlike her. Eleanor did not make unannounced visits, ever on principle. I heard the bell over the old bakery door downstairs, and assumed it was a delivery. Instead, there she was at the top of the stairs, in a coat too formal for a room full of wet clay and unfinished forms, looking around like someone walking into a church she hadn't known existed. "You did all this," she said. Not a question. I set down my tools. Most of it. She walked the room slowly, the way I imagined she once walked warehouse floors early in her career, cataloging without being asked to. She stopped in front of a half-finished piece near the window, a mother's hand, open, empty, rendered in a way that made most people look away before they understood why it moved them. She didn't look away. "The hospital wing," she said finally. "That was you." I nodded. $8.8 million. She said the number carefully, like she was testing whether it would still be true the second time. My son called that a little art thing. I didn't say anything. I'd learned by then that silence, held long enough, does more work than most sentences. "Why didn't you tell him?" she asked, and there was no accusation in it, only a genuine, almost pained curiosity. "Because I stopped believing he'd ask the right questions if I did," I said. "I didn't want it to become a thing he was proud of at parties. I wanted it to stay mine." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, still looking at the sculpted hand. "My husband did that to me once," she said. "Made something I built sound small, in front of people because it was easier than admitting he didn't understand it. It took me 9 years to stop shrinking myself to fit the size of his understanding." She turned to look at me directly. "I watched you do the same thing at my table, and I said nothing. I've been sorry about that since the moment I saw your name on that slide." I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, an old, guarded muscle I hadn't realized I'd been clenching for years. "I'm not here to fix my son," she said. "That's not mine to fix. I'm here because I think you've been alone in a room a long time, and I didn't want you to stay alone in it today." I hadn't cried about any of it. Not the dinner table, not the years before it, until Eleanor said that sentence, and something in me finally agreed to stop holding its breath. We sat on two paint-stained stools while I told her, in pieces, what I'd never told her son. About the hospital room 4 years earlier, the pregnancy that ended in its 20th week, the silence Marcus had offered me afterward that I'd mistaken, at the time, for a kind of grief too big for words. I understood now that it hadn't been grief. It had simply been absence, dressed convincingly. I told her about the Sensory Recovery Center, how the idea had come to me at 3 a.m. 8 months later, half-formed, insistent, a way of building something soft and permanent out of a loss that had no shape. How I'd started small, one modest installation, then another, working with hospital architects and child psychologists, learning an entire second language of trauma-informed design, until the gift I made this year became the culmination of something I'd never once explained to my own husband because he had never once asked why I disappeared to the studio on weekends, or what I was disappearing toward. He thought I was running from him, I said. I was running toward something. There's a difference, but I don't think he ever wanted to know which one it was. Eleanor listened the way I imagined she'd listened in boardrooms for decades, without interrupting, without rushing to comfort, letting the whole shape of a thing arrive before she responded to any part of it. "You built a room for other people's grief," she said finally, "because no one built one for yours." I hadn't thought of it in those exact words before, but they were true enough that I had to look away from her for a moment. "I'm not telling you what to do about my son," she said. "That's yours to decide, not mine, and I won't pretend otherwise. But I wanted you to hear this from someone who saw the truth of it. You were never small. You were only ever quiet. Those are not the same thing, and it isn't your job to keep letting him confuse them." I didn't confront Marcus that week or the next. Confrontation had never been the point, and I'd known that even before Eleanor's visit, though I hadn't been able to name it clearly until she said the word grief out loud in my studio and made it real. What I did instead was simpler and, in its own way, harder. I stopped hiding. I brought him to the studio on a Saturday, the first time in 3 years he'd been inside it. I showed him the hand sculpture, the maquette for the hospital wing, the photographs from the Zurich opening he'd never known existed because I'd traveled for it on a weekend. He thought I was visiting my sister. I watched something complicated move across his face. Not pride, not yet, something closer to the specific vertigo of realizing you've been standing next to a life you never bothered to look at directly. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" he said, and it wasn't quite a question, more a kind of disbelief looking for somewhere to land. "I tried for years in small ways," I said. "You weren't unkind about it most of the time. You were just never curious. There's a particular kind of loneliness in being loved by someone who's never once asked why you're building." He didn't defend himself, which surprised me. He sat down on the paint-stained stool Eleanor had sat on weeks before, and he looked, for a long moment, like a much younger and much less certain man than the one who'd told me I was embarrassing myself over dinner. "My mother told me what you did," he said. "The gift. She didn't tell me why. She said that part wasn't hers to give away." I didn't fill the silence for him. I let him sit inside it the way I'd sat inside so many silences of my own. "I don't know how to undo what I said that night," he said eventually. "You don't," I said gently because it was true and because gentleness at that point cost me nothing and might still mean something. "But you can decide from here whether you want to actually know who you're married to. That part's still available. The rest isn't. I won't pretend the months after that were simple, or that everything folded neatly into forgiveness the way it might in a story built to comfort rather than to tell the truth. Marcus and I went to therapy, separately at first and then together, and there were sessions where he sat with the particular shame of a man realizing that contempt is sometimes just fear wearing a more socially acceptable coat. He was afraid, it turned out, of being outpaced by me, afraid in a way he'd never examined closely enough to name, so it had leaked out sideways, at dinner tables, dressed as concern about appearances. Understanding that didn't erase what he'd said. but it gave me somewhere honest to stand while I decided what I actually wanted from what remained of the life we'd built. Eleanor and I kept meeting at the studio most Thursdays, sometimes to talk and sometimes just to sit while I worked and she read, the way I imagine mothers and daughters do when the relationship isn't obligated by blood but chosen anyway, slowly out of something closer to recognition than duty. She became, without either of us naming it directly, the first person in that family who had ever simply watched me work without needing to understand it in order to respect it. The hospital wing opened in early spring. I invited them both. Marcus stood in the sensory recovery room, soft light, curved walls, the open-hand sculpture mounted at the entrance where grieving parents would pass beneath it on their way in, and I watched him read the small plaque near the door for a long time. It didn't have my name on it. I'd asked for it to stay anonymous, the way the gift had always been meant to remain, but the foundation director had insisted on one line, in small type, in memory of what was carried, and in hope of what can still be held. He didn't say anything about it that day. He didn't need to. I could see, finally, that he understood what he was standing inside. People ask me sometimes, carefully, whether I forgave him. It's a smaller question than it sounds, and also a much larger one, and I've stopped trying to answer it in a single sentence. What I can say is this. I stopped needing him to understand me in order to know what I was worth. That shift happened quietly, in a room above an old bakery, with clay under my fingernails and a woman who wasn't my mother sitting on a paint-stained stool, telling me the truth before anyone else was ready to. Marcus and I are still married. It isn't the marriage either of us thought we were building 4 years ago, and it isn't, I think, a lesser one for having been rebuilt out of something more honest than the silence that came before it. He asks about the work now. Real questions, the kind that require him to actually listen to the answer. It took a long time to stop flinching when he did. Eleanor still comes on Thursdays. Last week, she brought a photograph she'd found of herself at 28, standing in front of a warehouse she'd just been promoted to run, a look on her face I recognized immediately because I'd worn it myself, alone, the day the hospital wing's final transfer cleared, the look of a woman who has just quietly proven something to no one but herself, and found that this was, in the end, more than enough. I think about that dinner table sometimes, the candles half melted, the word he chose without weighing it. I'm not angry when I think of it anymore. I think of it the way you think of whether you've already walked through, something that happened to you once, before you understood how much shelter you'd already built for yourself, quietly, in a room no one else had thought to enter. The gift was never about being seen. It was about surviving something unspeakable by making it useful to someone else's survival. That it also eventually became the thing that made a room finally see me, that was never the point. But I won't pretend it didn't feel, in the end, like a kind of quiet justice all its own.